Peter and I are delighted that Andrew joins us this evening. Andrew, thank you for your time. Firstly, though, I just want to raise this point that you made about China and Russia, where you argued last year that they had, quote, weaponised previously benign areas such as diplomacy, media, investment flows, infrastructure development and foreign asset purchases. Just explain that for us.
Well, good evening, Alan and Peter, and thanks for having me. Yes, I stand by those words, and it was in the context of political warfare that I wrote about China and Russia, authoritarian regimes who use the whole of nation approach to the pursuit of their strategic objectives. So whereas we have an open economy and we look at many areas of economy and government as benign, they see them as vectors or potential opportunities to advance their own interests, often at the expense of ours. And so we need to be constantly vigilant against threats to our sovereignty.
Of real relevance, though, to the young people, and I'm sure Peter does too, we get correspondence about this every day, you then said university campuses have become modern battlegrounds of covert influence and interference. You said complementing more aggressive forms of subversive warfare, such as intellectual property theft, cyber attacks and espionage. And you said the West needs to become more proactive. This is a real concern for many young people.
It is, and our university is a place where a lot of important research is undertaken, especially insofar as it serves the national interest, particularly for defence applications. And so when we partner with students who are sponsored by foreign governments, there's a risk that much of our intellectual property can be stolen and then used overseas effectively against our interests. So we need to think more carefully, not just about foreign investment flows, but also what's happening on our university campuses.
Peter?
Yeah, I just want to pick up that point that Andrew made. I mean, you swim against the tide, Andrew Hastie, not just because you're a West Australian, but also a Liberal. When you raise positions like that in the party room, that we should be more cautious about the involvement of research funding with Chinese-sponsored students, particularly in the defence and technology space. And I know you've been outspoken about Confucius institutes. Is that one of the reasons why you haven't been promoted? Because anyone who can hear you speak knows that you are an extraordinary political talent, and there's a lot more ahead of you who shouldn't be ahead of you.
Well, thanks, Peter. I'm right where I should be. I chair the Intelligence and Security Committee. I work closely with the Prime Minister and Peter Dutton and others, and so I'm glad to serve where I am. It's a very important role, and it's a privilege to be there.
That's a typical Peter Credlin question with which I agree.
Answer.
No, the question was great.
It's true.
The question was great. But Andrew, here we've got a virus from the wet markets of China wreaking havoc on the world economy, on individual well-being and economic strength. You said we must understand our adversaries. Are we still too passive towards China?
We do have to understand our adversaries. I mean, this coronavirus has done immense damage. Tonight, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is in intensive care, and only a week ago, the US carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt was forced to come alongside in the port of Guam because it had coronavirus. So we've got a world leader in intensive care, and we have a US carrier which underwrites our trade and its security being forced to come into port because of the coronavirus. This is very serious. So there are many legitimate questions that the Australian people and people around the world impacted by this are absolutely legitimate to ask. For example, did it originate in a wet market? And if not, and it originated potentially because of sloppy practices in a Wuhan lab, why is that being run in a vast metropolis? Why didn't the Chinese government alert us about the human-to-human transmission earlier? Why, after locking down travel within China, were people still able to leave the country and thereby export it to the rest of the world? These are legitimate questions, and there'll be a time to discuss them fully, and then a time to also respond, I think, as a country in the way that we think about our sovereignty, which the Prime Minister is very, very big on, and also our resilience, our ability to go it alone potentially for a period of time.
Andrew, notwithstanding that, we've got a New South Wales Upper House MP, Choquette Mossel-Main, a Labor bloke, praising President Xi's unswerving leadership, his words, in handling the coronavirus crisis. Quote, He mustered the resources of the nation and, together with the great people of China, fought it and contained it. He said, historically, China has longed for greatness, and the rules of the game continue to favour its opponents. The rules have to change. The only way for China to reach its potential is for China to force a change to the rules and create a new world order. Andrew, has the virus done the job?
Well, he should resign if he had any honour left, because he's spitting in the face of Australian taxpayers who put him there, electors who are now struggling to keep their businesses afloat, people who have lost their jobs. And here is a guy parroting the talking points of the Chinese Communist Party. So frankly, he should go, and sooner rather than later. And that's a widely held view. I know Peter Dutton called for it last week. I know Labor members are expressing that very view to me as well. So the coronavirus is a big moment in our history, and we don't need goons like that in our parliaments peddling the views of the CCP.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Peter.
Andrew, I want to just go back to Wuhan. A couple of things strike me as interesting. I know there's a lot of theories about whether or not it truly came from the wet market or not. I think that's something that will come out over time. I know there's a US intelligence report that says they don't think that it came out in a covert way, let's say. But what it's shown quickly, how biological warfare can be used if it was for nefarious reasons. Look at how fast this has disabled economies around the world, how it's paralysed particularly the West. If you were Iran or a rogue state watching this, you could see how you could bring the West to its knees within a matter of weeks. What I found unusual, and I've not got a decent explanation for this, how is it that Wuhan of 60 million people, or Hubei province of 60 million people, takes this disease and it goes around the world within a matter of days into Italy, the markets of Milan, where a lot of Chinese workers move, and then all the way through Europe. We've seen Spain, the UK, US, and now Australia. But it's not in Beijing, which is the centre of Chinese power, and it never made its way to Shanghai, which is the commercial power centre. So how did China insulate everywhere else, but the rest of the world got infected?
Well, and that comes back to my question, why on January 23, when China locks down its own country, they still let people fly out, particularly from Hubei province, and thereby exporting the coronavirus around the world? This is a really important question, and I know people want answers. Just also on your point, Peter, about the West and general strategic resilience, it shows how vulnerable we are to strategic coercion or supply chain warfare. If we're reliant on the importation of liquid fuels, pharmaceuticals, I know people who have received organ transplants, for example, they rely on critical medicines to keep them going. And then indeed advanced manufacturing, just for the production of basic things like PPE. We need to have a good discussion about our country and the things that we need to preserve, regardless if they cost us more than if we were to put them to the global market, because there are some things you just can't put a price on.
See, Andrew, you have said there are other ways we weaken our defences. Now, you're the chairman of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. You warned 2 years ago, you just mentioned then, the fuel crisis, that our fuel stockpile, you said, was well below the mandated minimum for the past 5 years. At the time, we had 22 days of crude oil should an emergency arise. Now, despite our international obligation, we've got to maintain a minimum 90 days emergency oil stockpile so that we can defend ourselves and operate in situations where global supplies are threatened. Isn't this where we are today on matters other than fuel? A whole raft of our necessities have been outsourced. We've allowed China to own everything: dairy farms, beef farms, avocado farms, coal, water, the Port of Darwin. Doesn't this nonsense have to stop?
Well, we've always been a trading nation, Alan, as I've said before. First it was wool that made this country prosperous, and then we shifted to resources. Alumina, bauxite, iron ore, coal, gas, you name it, we export it. We could be an energy superpower. But certainly we've also export a lot of food to Asia as well. So it's critical to our prosperity, and it sustains thousands of Australian jobs. We don't want to pull the drawbridge up, but we must do things from a position of strength and on our terms. And the Foreign Investment Review Board, I think, of the last decade or so, hasn't been thorough enough in its oversight of foreign investment, and that's why the government's decision, Prime Minister Morrison and the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg a week ago, reducing the threshold to $0 for all foreign investment during this period where we are very weak and vulnerable, particularly Australian businesses that might be distressed and vulnerable.
Yeah, Andrew, I've got to jump in there, mate, though. This is a 6-month moratorium, and Alan and I were right onto this straight away as soon as you could see that there would be distressed Australian company assets. No issue. I have no issue with foreign investment. I have a big issue with foreign ownership and foreign control, particularly when you have silo operations that own dairy, dairy processing, dairy exporting. You say, you know, we could be an energy superpower, and well, we are, except we export it all. And we could be better at our horticulture and agriculture, but we're not brave enough to build dams. I mean, surely out of this, there has got to be a rude awakening about what Australia's next 20 years looks like, and we've got to make some tough... If we can make all these political decisions to spend $130 billion on propping up jobs, surely we can spend $10 billion of that on a Bradfield scheme.
That's exactly right, Peter. This is a first step in the right direction. I called it prudent statecraft in a crisis. This is just securing our perimeter, making sure that we can't get any predators coming in and buying up distressed Australian businesses and assets. It's the start of a conversation about how we recalibrate and we work in the national interest. And we need to do this bipartisanly. I mean, after all, this is a virus that has put a UK Prime Minister in intensive care, and it's effectively stopped a US carrier group. And we need to look long and hard about our own economy, our own strategic vulnerabilities, and in the coming months and years, protect against them.
But Andrew, I'm sure you understand, though, the anger out there. In 2017-18 alone,
I do.
This useless Foreign Investment Review Board received more than 11,000 applications, not for investment, for ownership, totalling $163.1 billion. They approved the lot except 5. Now, you've raised this stuff with the Foreign Investment Review Board. Shouldn't these rules, as Peter just said, be permanently tightened?
Well, there'll be many of us, including myself, who will be pushing for a much tighter set of rules governing this space. We can't have businesses vertically integrated, so effectively it's the equivalent of me getting a straw, Alan, and drinking your milkshake, as made famous by Daniel Day-Lewis in the movie There Will Be Blood. We can't have that happening to our economy, and Australians effectively missing out because a foreign state can just reach in and take what they want. So, of course, that's going to be part of the discussion.
Yeah, let's not be too tough. Can I just jump in here too? Because I was involved in an election commitment in 2013 where we screwed down a lot of the rules on FIRB. FIRB is a body that administers the law decided by the politicians in Canberra. So what the FIRB rules are, what the thresholds are, what the disclosure requirements are that are put before the Foreign Investment Review Board are determined by your government, Andrew, just like Tony Abbott took stuff to the election in 2013, like Labor for many years, let this system run rampant. It's really up to political will here. And Alan's right, there's only a small team in Treasury that support FIRB. Well, there should be a bigger team and there should be better rules.
Sure.
And they should be permanent and debated. So I hope, you know, you've got a big voice in the party room. And you're from Western Australia, as I said, but, you know, I had Ian Duncan Smith, former Tory leader, on my show last week, and he calls it Project Kowtow. All these political leaders around the world who just kowtow to China because of the god-awful dollar, and he's in a real push, and you would know this very well, in the UK, to get Boris Johnson and the Tory party to overturn their decision on Huawei. Now, surely that's got to be something that changes after coronavirus.
Well, that's right. Here's the thing. We're a country before we are an economy, Peter and Alan. So that's my starting premise. And we need to safeguard the interests of all Australians. And we also need leadership from the business community on this stuff as well. A bit of patriotism in the corporate sector would not go astray, I can tell you that much.
Absolutely.
And so, yes.
Brilliant.
Yeah, so we will be having this discussion. That's what parliamentarians do. I look forward to these debates because certainly, as you identified, Alan, people are very angry out there.
They're very angry. Andrew, just before we go, we could talk to you all night. It's fantastic. And you've confirmed everything Peter and I have said at the beginning. But just one final thing. You said the other day, many of the assumptions underpinning the Australian economy have changed in the last 2 weeks. We all need to be realists now. Human nature remains the same. There are always threats to our Australia, particularly in crises like the present one. How, just simply at the end of this episode and interview tonight, how then do you see the future?
Well, I think it's the return of reality for a lot of people. As I said, the underlying assumptions of the economy in the last fortnight have changed. So too have the assumptions of the two-party political system. So politicians who fail to realise what's changed around them, in my view, won't survive long with the Australian people, because the correspondence I'm receiving is that people are very frustrated, very concerned, and they want us to take action in the interest of Australian sovereignty and in the interest of Australian resilience. And so that's the task ahead, and that's the one that me and other colleagues like Tim Wilson and James Patterson, Amanda Stoker, Alex Antic, and people on the Labor side like Anthony Byrne and Kimberley Kitching, who all stood up on the weekend. And I apologise if I've missed anyone there,
yes.
But certainly they're along for the ride.